Welcome to online training on impact evaluation for evidence-based development for the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs of the Gambia. Module 5. Qualitative approaches in impact evaluation, non-experimental methods. Module 5, Lesson 3, Outcome Mapping. Under this lesson, we will share the expected outcomes, have a brief introduction to outcome mapping, and then have a detailed description of outcome mapping, then share the steps that are involved in outcome mapping and the various uses of outcome mapping. The expected outcomes of this lesson are that by the end of the lesson, participants will be able to explain what outcome mapping can add to program impact evaluation, as well as identify the settings for outcome mapping application. We'll be able to identify different methods and what is involved in doing or undertaking outcome mapping. And then finally, apply best practices for outcome mapping in relation to program impact evaluation. Introduction. This lesson outlines the description of outcome mapping, basic principles, and outcome mapping methods, as well as various domains of its application. The centrality of outcome mapping is that it is anchored in the recognition that development is essentially about people relating to each other and their environment. So what is outcome mapping? You will recall among the key definitions that we had in Module 1 was that of outcome. So what does outcome mapping entail? Outcome mapping is a methodology for planning, monitoring, and evaluating development initiatives with the sole purpose of bringing about sustainable social change. Let me underline social change. As we see in this context, the preoccupation of outcome mapping is understanding outcomes. The so-called missing middle or the black box of results that emerge downstream from the initiative's activities, but upstream from the longer term economic, environmental, political, or demographic changes. So on the one hand, we have the results. That arise from implementing the initiatives. And on the work stream, upper stream, we have the longer term changes. In between, the dynamics that play intermediary between these two is what is the preoccupation of outcome mapping. Outcome mapping builds the monitoring and evaluation into the design stage. And it is participatory. It zooms in on outcomes. So it gets close to the outcomes. At planning stage, outcome mapping process helps projects or programs to be specific about the actors it intends to target, the changes it hopes to see, and the strategies that are appropriate to achieve the aspired change. That's the centrality of outcome mapping being brought on board into the design stage of an intervention. Therefore, as an evaluation approach, we see that outcome mapping is able to unpack and tease out the theory of change of an initiative. How? By providing a framework through which data is collected on immediate basic changes that lead to longer, more transformative changes. And therefore, in this context, outcome mapping allows for plausible assessment of the initiative's contribution to the results. And as you recall, this is the core business of impact evaluation. In this regard, we are able to see outcome mapping as often requiring a mind shift of personal and organization paradigms or theories of social change. This is best illustrated by Michael Quinn Patton. That outcome mapping provides not only a guide to essential evaluation map making, but also a guide to learning and increased effectiveness and affirmation that being attentive along the journey is as important as and critical to arriving at a destination. What this means is that in looking at the evaluation process, we need to examine thoroughly the social changes of interest right at the onset of the initiative, so that when we get at the end of the initiative by way of impact assessment, we are sure that the journey we have tracked has been very systematic by collecting the required data along the way that will help us to be able to project the change that is assessed at the end of the initiative. What are the steps that are involved in outcome mapping? Outcome mapping differs from traditional metrics in that it does not focus on measuring deliverables and its effects on primary beneficiaries. Rather, it focuses on behavioral change that is exhibited by secondary beneficiaries. The focus is not on the primary beneficiaries, but the focus is on the behavioral change of secondary beneficiaries. We see outcome mapping involving 12 logical steps lumped up into 3 stages. The first stage is intentional design. The second stage is outcome and performance monitoring. And the third and final stage is evaluation planning. Let us look at the design stage. The design stage of outcome mapping helps in terms of establishing the consensus on the project's main intended changes. We see this manifested in spelling out the vision, the mission, the boundary partners that are involved, the outcome challenges, the progress markers, the strategy maps, and the organizational practices around the initiative. In this regard, we see the design stage of outcome mapping as answering 4 basic questions. The first question is why? What is the vision to which the program or initiative wants to contribute? Why does it have to be implemented? The second question is how? How will the program contribute to the change process that we have identified amongst boundary partners. The third question is who? Who are the program's boundary partners? In other words, who are the focal stakeholders for this initiative, for this program? And finally, what are the tangible changes that are being sought in rolling out this intervention? So these questions have to be very clear at the design stage. The second stage is monitoring stage. The outcome and performance monitoring stage provides data collection tools, mainly journals, for the elements that have been identified in the design stage. The various aspects that we have talked about under design stage, we need to systematically collect data about them. So the monitoring stage involves 4 stages. The monitoring priorities, which one do we need to focus our energies on? The outcome journeys, what are the expected outcomes that we have defined based on the partners, the stakeholders that we have defined? And then the strategy journal, the how part. How are we implementing the outcome mapping? And then performance journal, how do we assess the progress being made in rolling out the intervention? And finally, the evaluation planning stage. We have designed, we are implementing, we are monitoring. Now we have to look at the assessing the results. So evaluation planning stage helps project to identify the evaluation priorities, the more in-depth review of progress that the intervention has registered, and develop an evaluation plan that makes good use of the resources. So this stage essentially involves evaluation planning. And in that plan, we need to provide the process and the tool for designing the evaluation of the program using outcome mapping. Are there any comments and questions or clarifications? There are a set of questions to assist us assess our grasp of the lesson. These are self-paced assessment questions. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Merci beaucoup.